Fantastic. And hearing, I mean, initially we have three presentations that seem somewhat unrelated, right? We're talking about politics, we're talking about writing, we're talking about worship. But, you know, when you think about qualitative research as something that's tying these things together, you know, what I feel compelled to sort of emphasize for all of us is that the writing only becomes real when you see the bodies and you engage the bodies of the persons that you're writing about. You know, politics is only real, you know, when you are engaged with the bodies that are in that system, processing that system, and worship. Wow, I mean, worship. You know, if Glenn's thesis is correct, is only fully understood in that moment when the songs and the ritual and everything meets that personal experience. And I think that, you know, we're hitting on a note here that qualitative research brings embodied people, not just our hearts, not just our minds, but our lives and all of that together, right? And sort of with that note, I do want to open it up for a larger conversation. If there, Rochelle, if you see any questions that from the chat that you would like to pose, and we'll also open it up for questions here in the audience.
I just posted the first one for me.
Okay, Luke, if you take a look at the chat, we get the system down right at the end, right? This is how these conferences work. Luke, if you take a look at the chat, you'll see the question there for you. And so I won't have to read it out loud. You can just take a look at that and overview it. And Rochelle is lining up those questions. I think she's searching them in the back. So Luke, any?
Yeah, so I'm going to sound like a horrible Anglican Episcopalian that I am, which is to say yes and no to that question, which is, I think, yeah. So I mean, I think for theology to methodologically integrate qualitative research, there's a way in which it can stay in its disciplinary lane, as it were, and still constructively be theology, along the lines of the kind of mutually disciplinary relationship that I laid out. So that's the straightforward yes to that question. The no bit is, so I'm doing some work with a wonderful anthropologist at the University of Toronto, Valentina Napoliana, and you know, she's a very straightforward she's a social anthropologist who does work in kind of Catholic studies on migrant communities in Italy and elsewhere. And she, in her work, the theological shows up both in a kind of descriptive sense and in a kind of normative sense. She's trying to say, she's kind of commenting on the place of migrant communities and how the church functions to give them political agency in a country like Italy in a way when they don't have documentation or don't have citizenship status. And she's kind of drawing on Catholic social teaching at the same time to say the theistic needs to kind of trouble and unpick some of the assumptions that govern how we do social anthropology. So it's doing constructive work in how she thinks about social anthropology and in what she's saying is going on and how we should think about the place of migrants in a society like Italy and how we think about migrants migrant communities more generally and the role of religion in constituting their agency when everything is diminishing their agency. So I think that's the kind of no bit. I think we can. And this relates to a broader point. I think we're working in a post-secular moment when the established kind of fixed lines of travel, theology is showing up all over the place. Social science is showing up in theology, and it's no longer the kind of Tillichian or the David Tracy, how do I critically correlate this to the other? It's like a jacuzzi. Everything's bubbling up everywhere. And it's slightly fetid waters and nasty, and I'm not a fan of jacuzzis. And we've got to kind of work out how to navigate this slightly strange and the kind of interpenetrations. Sorry, it's inappropriate term, but the kind of mutual interpretations that are going on of different discourses and fields. I'm heading down a very slippery, tricky slope here. But anyway, so you get what I'm saying. I better stop myself there. Yeah, the second there was a B. Yeah, so I think there's a technical, to kind of summarize what I'm saying. I think there's a technical side index to, you need to get a job, or you need to make yourself legible in particular departmental or disciplinary spaces. That requires paying attention to how you narrate, frame, structure the work to meet those kind of disciplinary commitments. At the same time, there's a certain free form, free jazz factor in how you do the work, which can't be simply, you won't get to do good work if you just try and prescribe from the outset the way you're doing the research and where you're imagining, narrating, thinking about the work. If you operate in the rather artificial prescribed academic boundaries that you're given, but it is this tricky balance. You have to render yourself legible, while at the same time, to do good work, we're in a much more jacuzzi-like space.
Thank you, Luke. And that your answer actually, and that question ties perfectly well to the next question. It's not on the chat anymore, but I think you did read it earlier about jargon and how to phrase questions.
Yeah. I would say, yes, to what Luke just said, I made a very similar kind of an argument in my chapter for this Wiley Blackwell book about at the stage of competency. I'm saying, as we learn as writers, is where we run into the questions of disciplinary legibility, to use your word, to be allowed into the guild, right? To be able to publish our dissertations and then other articles and books. It's a kind of competency that requires both.
Yes.
Meeting the demands of those guilds, but also not being limited by them. Because if we're limited by them, we're not going to do our work very well, because they're pretty limiting. So it's a really hard thing this is not an easy thing to learn. And it's a deeply emotional and challenging personally to learn that truth in your writing. So the question about how to distinguish a research question from an interview question. This book, which just came out, I get to hold it up because it came out in May. It's still a book baby. We got to treat it like a baby, right? No, this is pastoral imagination, bringing the practice of ministry to life. This includes many, many stories that we gathered from the Learning Pastoral Imagination Project. And it's written, however, for pastors. This is not written for my academic colleagues, except I want them to teach from it, because it's written for the people who will practice ministry. And it's how they learn to practice ministry. And when we go into these, the first rounds of this research, we only had 3 questions when we got to an interview day. And the first one was, on the first round, tell us how you got to this point in your life. And they could answer that any way they wanted. Why did that work? Because we didn't say, tell us about your vocation, or tell us why you're a pastor. We didn't limit it to we let them frame how they got to this point in their life. Like that day, we're here. How'd you get here? And then we also, not to be completely fair, Chris Sharon and I also, to model that for them, we told a story of our own formation as pastors about how we got to the point we were at in how we got to ministry. And it was interesting. Someday I'll maybe go back and get all the transcripts of all the stories Chris and I told, because that is an interesting little book or article in itself. Why did we choose the ones we did? We kind of challenged ourselves to tell something different every time. We didn't want to hear the same stories or tell the same stories every time. And so when I was with a certain group, I would just find myself drawn to a different kind of story from my own past about what made me who I was as a pastor and an academic and a researcher, et cetera. And that question was earlier, we just changed hats all the time. So the second question we would ask is one I already said, tell us about an aha moment of your learning. We're trying to understand how people learn. How do people learn? When they have a moment that pulls them up short. That's a language we use from Deborah Kurteman, and she's an educational researcher. We don't say, tell us what pulled you up short. We just say, tell us about an aha moment. That might be a really positive, glorious, transcendent moment, or it might be a I fell in the ditch on the way to work and I didn't know what it meant, but it meant something really bad. You never know what people will tell you about that. Those are usually very, very thick stories that have a lot of layers of meaning in them. And they're things that they've continued to return to. So we get a sense of what's going on there. And then the third question we would ask is, what prepared you for ministry? And we don't say seminary, we don't say anything. We just say, what prepared you for ministry? And they tell us all kinds of things. Managing a bookstore. My dad was a pastor. Field education, CPE. CPE is probably the number one answer about what prepared people for ministry in our study.
Just say what CPE is for non-US.
That's right. Clinical pastoral education, which is an immersion into doing ministry, usually in a hospital or a healthcare setting, but becoming a chaplain at the beginning stages. And it's all these feedback loops about what you're doing, how you're doing it. It's learning and practice. And the reason that, not the reason, but one of the things we found most interesting in that first round of interviews was very few people said, Luke Brotherton's classroom. We didn't interview Becky Duke. I'm just picking on him. They said Rachel's classroom. They said the places where they were doing ministry. And that's because learning and practice is about doing it. Yep. And in theological, so I have a big subplot in all of my work, which is to revise and reform theological education. Amen. To teach for practice and right. Not just teach ideas. They're wonderful. We need ideas. We need to know how they move in the world and what they do. And that's practice. So that's what this book is about. But here's the fun thing about this book that I didn't plan on at all. It's got a bunch of stories about me in it. Ooh. Ooh. Yeah, I felt a little bit like Barbara Meyerhoff by the time I got done. I was like, wow, there's so many stories about me in here. But it wasn't because I just wrote a book. I did a year-long weekly video series where I presented these stories in 3-minute segments because I wanted people to have access to what I was learning. I didn't want it locked up behind an academic paywall, which gets into a whole different set of questions about how we write and who we write for.
It's good.
Fantastic. Do we have any questions from the present audience? Is there anything that might be?
Got a name in.
Glenn, did you want to say?
I just wanted to jump in and say something. Thanks, Luke. I just wanted to say something about, I'm not sure if this term's been used earlier in the day. I caught the session 1. I had to miss session 2, unfortunately. But the idea of theological ethnography, where it fits within congregational studies, but again, what you're trying to draw out is the embedded or operated or espoused theology. And so one of the methodologies I used in my work was the 4 voices, kind of approach where there's a normative voice, a formal voice, and an operant and an espoused voice of theology. I'm doing what I did when I was doing this work was about hope. How is hope encoded in these songs, and how is hope experienced in these services? And they're different things, but you compare them against. So as you're doing this work, you kind of figure out, well, what's the sort of normative or standard of Christian hope? Well, okay, let's go with the creeds and let's pull some phrases out of there. Well, what about the formal voices? What are formal theologians in these traditions saying about hope? Okay, good, we got that. Then what's the espoused theology of hope? What are people saying from the platform? What are they saying in their songs? This is where texts do become helpful. This is where the interviews, semi-structured interviews with people who hold positions of authority that you're interviewing, that stuff matters. But then to get at operant theology of hope, it's kind of what Eileen is describing. You don't ask direct questions, you ask these indirect questions. So I couldn't say to people, tell me if you experienced hope in worship this weekend. Oh, you can't do that because it's objection, Your Honor, leading the witness. So you have to say, have you ever come to church feeling one way and you left feeling another way? I didn't even say feeling, a positive change. And then you let people kind of share those stories. Okay, now what happens to that feeling on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday? And what do you do when that, goes away? So there are ways of structuring the interview that don't give away the thing you're looking for and don't confirm your hypothesis automatically. And I think there is an art to that, especially in knowing the difference when you're interviewing, say, a gatekeeper like a pastor who's going to give you the right answers versus a congregant who might be more hesitant even to say something that disagrees with the unofficial statements and that kind of thing. In the book that someone put a link on to earlier, was an IVP academic last year, Worship in the World to Come, to the chagrin of readers who are pastors and not seminarians or divinity students. Chapter 1 is all methodology. So I often will tell people, skip chapter 1, but for this crew, maybe only read chapter 1.
Fantastic. Do we have any other questions from either the audience?
And then when you talked about telling stories and getting people to open up and answer the question, is there a worry that it might lead them to try and emulate your story or to tell a story like your story? Not tell the story?
Sure. I mean, there was a worry about it. So the way we dealt with that was
Can you repeat the question?
So the question was, when Eileen and Christian were sharing stories as sort of templates for other people to respond, was there ever a concern that the informant would be looking for stories that matched, was there a leading the witness dynamic at play, if you will?
we accepted the fact that we would influence them and that we were not simply there to be dispassionate researchers. We're there to start a relationship with them, which we've now been in for 12 years. And so we don't at subsequent interviews, we don't tell our stories like that. That's never really, we give them an update about the project at the end of the day. We spend a full day with each group of 5 ministers when we interview them. But we accepted that we would influence them, and we really set it up to say, look, we want to build a space of trust, and we do a whole series of things to build trust. And one of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to tell you about who we are. And then we want you to not tell a story just like we did. We want you to tell your own story about what brought you to this point in your life. So we just named those things. It still doesn't change the fact that we were influencing the process, but we don't see that as a negative. We see that we are theological and pastoral researchers. And so we're in a relational context where we are learning together what it is to practice ministry and how to learn that over time. And we did it too. So we just are part of that process with them. We're not we're not intentionally trying to shape them. We don't want to, but we also have to show up as ourselves. That's why I ended up in the book, because it's also my work and my story. And it's been kind of hard getting there. My first book, my story is not in my first book at all. And it's intentional. Why? Because disciplinarily, I didn't want the historians, the ethnographers, or the pastoral theologians to reject me as just being a whining, complaining clergywoman who didn't get her way with her denomination. I wanted the arguments in my book to get priority. It might, I might do it over different, but I'm older now,
And this touches on a theme that has been explored in our first session to now, in terms of the quality of bringing our own voices into what we're doing, especially if we're claiming to be theologians, right? And one of the perspectives I want to bring is, if you look at the classic theologians, they also didn't say anything about their perspective, and that's caused some problems actually, in terms of the way that they're read, and then people have to go digging for their lives to make sense of it. So for me, there's a part of me that says, if you are upfront with certain things, you're actually setting up the church for a much more engaging process. Like, this is my situation. Yes, good. Augustine is a good example of what we need, actually.
Well, sort of.
Cheeky.
Yeah, that was an observation that came to mind. We have just a few minutes to close, so I would like to give our esteemed panelists just a last word. Luke, Glenn, and Eileen, just any last word you would like to share with our audience online, as well as here in the room, about this topic of qualitative research and theology. And
just a quick comment. I'll just go a quick comment on that previous point, because I think the Resurrecting Democracy, which is based on this 4-year ethnography, the initial draft of that I appeared in the story, and I gave it to someone who actually didn't do. I did a book manuscript workshop on it, and there were very few social science kind of orientated folk in there, or people who'd done kind of theological work drawing on ethnographic work, and they said that don't make yourself the hero of the story. Like, don't. There's too much of you in it. Get yourself out of it. So I rewrote it and took myself out of it, and I kind of regret it now. I think that was a mistake. I think, and this goes back to something Eileen said, I think in this kind of work, and it was very important to doing that work, that I established a kind of mutual reciprocal relationship. I think there are certain kinds of work. At the time, Pete might remember this, we had a colleague at King's who was doing work on far right groups and doing kind of qualitative research on them, and obviously that makes kind of there's ethical challenges. You don't really want a reciprocal relationship where you're contributing to the work in certain kinds. But in terms of a lot of the groups we're looking at, and certainly in relation to the community organizing work, there was a sense in which there was both a mutual accountability and a reciprocity involved in it. And I was changed, and I think I contributed to the work as well through it. And I think that would have really helped the text. And I think conventions are changing. And I think right across the humanities and social sciences. And so partly in debates around structural location and kind of identity questions, the use of I and the use of we and the kind of refusal to kind of talk from Olympian heights is becoming much more standard practice. And I think academic publishers expect that. And I think it makes for better writing. So I think, that's a word of encouragement to head in that direction. And then I think there are obviously traditions of self-reflexivity in ethnographic writing, and the kind of extreme of the over-identification, obviously that goes on. Certain kind of postmodern ethnography, it was just really all about your experience, not about the experience of others. And that's the opposite extreme. But there is a happy medium where it's about this. I'm learning and being transformed through this process of writing and an encounter, and others, and I'm also seeing what's going on here as well, and that I think also centers the nature of what it means to be human and change through time, through encounter, and the dialogic process that you're kind of mapping through the writing. So that was just a kind of quick response to that question.
I'd love to build on that, or just affirm and say my own experience was this. I told you I left myself out of the Anatomy of a Schism book, intentionally, very deliberately. And then when it was out, and a month later, I went to a workshop to start really digging into the next book, which was on clergy women. Again, but a much broader view from the LPI study and beyond. I had to spend that week struggling with how was I going to show up in that book? And I'll give you the short answer, which was I came to the point after a week of struggle and writing and crying and all kind of things, that the way I show up to an interview day, where I'm there and I'm present and I'm a witness and I'm a listener and I'm making space for people's stories, that's exactly the person I want to be when I show up in my own book. And that was tremendously helpful and liberating to me, that I had a particular way, so that either or, I'm either totally in it and it's all about me, postmodern, navel gazing, blah, 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 or I'm not in it at all. There's really a lot of ground between those two. And so I found the one that was right for me, and that it influenced. This book leapfrogged ahead of the Clergy Women book, which is about 70% written. And this one came out first, and it reflects my struggle earlier to figure out my voice in things. And it will continue to evolve, I'm sure. But I like the idea of showing up in my book in the exact same way I show up to an interview or research process, and being that person in the book. So.
Good.
You have the last word.
Well, amen is what I would say to all of that's already been said. And I think the only thing I would add from my perspective is, I think John Swinton said it this morning, talking about prayer or praying, with the people. And of course, there's some pushback on some of that. But I had the thought too, Luke, when you mentioned the imminent frame idea, if this is only about qualitative research, then studying congregational worship would be ethnomusicology. It would be that sort of descriptive work. But because it's theology and qualitative research, I think we have to do some work with the theology of the Spirit, because if we think of the idea that it is the Holy Spirit who takes, and I'll take my field, congregational worship, the Holy Spirit always makes worship more than the sum of its parts. Then what we're trying to get at in qualitative research and the theology we're trying to get at is a theology of the Spirit in bodies in space and time, at work in bodies in space and time. So yes, to putting ourselves in it. And then I would say, find some way to look for the Spirit at work in this. And maybe that's the typical thing that you'd expect a charismatic guy to say, but I do think a theology of the Spirit is the kind of inquiry that we're trying to follow in theology and qualitative research.
Just one quick thing. So I love that what you just said, Glenn. And I think it's for Pete and I say we're mourning the loss of a shared mentor, Andrew Walker, who was a key figure actually in the early kind of development of relationship ethnography and theology. And he, I think, really taught me the importance really of the work. Was doing this kind of work had at its heart a kind of discernment of spirits. And if we just name things theologically, we're just naming things theologically. We're not naming the action of the Spirit amongst these people in this place at this time. And if we're just doing qualitative work, there's a kind of refusal that there's something more going on here than just empirically verifiable things. And so I think there's a profound theology that also pushes us to do the qualitative research to say, how do we discern what Spirit is at work here? And is it bringing life or is it bringing death? And I think
good.
That's a very, very, very kind
of. And I think on that topic, I think I know the theme for our next gathering. It'll be pneumatology and qualitative. I think that's the direction. And again, thank you to everyone who's joined us. I want to give the last word, of course, to Dr. Pete Ward, who really came up with this idea, dragged me and Rochelle in on it, but really he was thinking about something, and we're trying to meet a need. And Pete, please give some concluding remarks to our online participants as well as all of us here.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Easton, you and to Rochelle. Really, you made this how good it's been, I think. And all of the speakers and participants, thank you so much. Thank you for volunteering to come and do this. And the check is probably in the post, which isn't a joke. And for those of you that are attending, do sign up for the Ecclesiology and Ethnography email list, and more events are coming, both that we're organising, but also that others are organising. And if you're doing something that you want advertised through this network, just send it to us and we will plug it for you, because this is not a franchise, it's a community of people doing stuff. So thank you very much. We've run over time, which is one of my core values, never to do. But thank you very much, and it's good night from me, and it's good night from him, her, and her.
And we'll be in touch. We will be sending out a survey to gather some feedback and use that survey information to hopefully build a second event that will continue to address needs. We really want to support graduate students and supervisors. That's been the goal of this event and for the book. So look out for that survey for those of you that are attending. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day, wherever you are in the world.